Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's time once again for another one of our ism segments, and I thought today I would cover vigilantism. Vigilantism. And typically when I do one of these isms, I sort of distinguish or separate out those isms which describe a particular ideology, and those isms that might describe instead an activity or a propensity. And I'm going to suggest that this is one of those that kind of has a foot in both of those camps. That vigilantism is, in one sense, an activity that is, in another sense, typically driven by an ideology. Well, first, the activity is simply this. The practice of vigilantism is the practice of giving punishment to those deemed to be guilty by private citizens apart from the law. One of the complaints against Batman in the world of of Gotham City. Oh, what a faux pas. In the world of Gotham City, is that he is a vigilante. He is a private citizen. He's got no police authority invested in him. He may have the approval of certain parts of the police, but he has no police authority, and yet he doles out punishment against people he deems to be criminals. And that's one of the ways that you might see vigilantism. Another way is in the practice of lynching. When the angry mob shows up at the jail in order to exact their own sense of justice on the accused before he's been given a trial. Or it happens when we essentially have kangaroo courts that don't really follow any principles of justice. Which brings us to the ideology behind it. Vigilantism exists because there are people out there who believe not only that governments sometimes fail to execute justice, I think that's absolutely true, but who think that because governments sometimes fail to bring justice to pass, which is their calling, that private citizens have the obligation to do so in their stead. It's a common kind of problem. In fact, I would say it's a subset of this idea that looks at the world and says, God has called this job to be done by that person or that group of persons. And when it's not being done, then, we need to have someone come alongside and do it instead of them. There's all sorts of ways that can manifest itself. Well, here's one. The poor. It's not true, though it's commonly held to be true, that the reason the government got into the business of taking care of the needs of poor people is because the church was falling down on the job. It's absolute 100% hogwash. The church was not falling down on the job in the least. The reason the government got involved in it is because it was to their political advantage. Now, if the church had failed in its job to care for the poor, does that mean it's right for the government to take over? Well, no. It's essential. In a sense, it's what's the word for it? Ministry vigilantism. It is seizing authority where one doesn't have authority, which is really a long-winded way to say that we really need to be careful before we're concerned about getting a job done. We need to be careful to stay in our lane, to recognize the limits of our own jurisdiction. Well, we have a duty to not take over the responsibilities of others when they're not doing it. We may have a duty to help them. We may have a duty to judge them for failing to do their responsibilities. But what actually happens when we take over for someone that's failing to do the job they're called to do is we encourage others to fail to do the job they're called to do. It's not grace. It's not kindness. It's enabling. Now, worse still, coming back to vigilantism, so often vigilantes are those who disagree with the judgment of the government and because of that take the law into their own hands. And sometimes they're right in that disagreement. The vigilante is. The guy may be guilty and the government, because it's corrupt, may let him go. But there are other times where the guy's not guilty, but they don't like the government reaching that conclusion, and so they take the law into their own hands. We have to stay calm. We have to let institutions go through the processes that they're supposed to go through. We have to trust God and remember that He says that vengeance is His and that He will repay. And never take up the mantle of becoming vigilantes. I'd like to share with you what I would call my literary DNA. Those 23 writers that made me me. Now, this doesn't mean that they're to blame for what I am. Nor does it mean that I'm saying this is what everybody else needs to read. I'm just talking about the people who had the biggest influence on me. You know, because it takes one to know one. Among the realms in which this truism is true is the world of the writer. Writers know writers. While science-y things are well beyond my decidedly non-STEM minded mind, I do have some skill in discerning not just who is a writer, but which writers, some writers, read. I know there are companies out there that promise with a spit and a promissory note, they'll tell you your genetic background. But what if we could list our 23 writing ancestors? If you were to cut open my writer's mind and put it under a microscope, whose inky fingerprints would you find? I've thought it through and I've come up with my own list. I encourage you to do the same. It is, if we are honest with ourselves, a healthy experiment. And if you're so inclined, I'd love to see your literary gene mapping as well. I'm going to list mine in a broad order, making no promise to be exact. Nor do I wish necessarily to defend these influences. I'm just trying to be honest, not put up a pious front. So here they are. Number 1, R.C. Sproul. Of course, no one else could top this list. Some of my favorite memories were those times when I was privileged to read his books in manuscript form. Again, he is not to blame for my weaknesses. If I have any strengths, one way or another, they likely came through him. Number 2, C.S. Lewis. Shocking to me that someone not reformed and so often so badly wrong would make the list. Until you realize it's C.S. Lewis. Matthew Henry. I have more than my fair share of commentaries, none of which I believe can hold a candle to Henry. He always got to the heart of the matter. Number 4, G.K. Chesterton. First, a writing grandfather, as he would surely be first on Lewis's list. But along with this son, he is tops in both piercing insight into the human condition and in the earth-shaking turn of a phrase. Number 5, John Gerstner, another writing grandfather, as he would surely be high on my father's list. Absolutely penetrating mind. In person, absolutely humble heart. Sinclair Ferguson, number 6. Greatest pastor-theologian pastor of the last centuries. A pen flowing with the blood of Christ. Number 7. Neil Postman. His amusing ourselves to death made me a reader of writers of substance, which led me to reading more Neil Postman. Number 8, E. Michael Jones. His capacity to connect personal history with ideology that has shaped the world is like no one else. He reveals, demonstrates the great wisdom and truth of Romans chapter 1. Number 9, Paul Johnson. Steady and fruitful from beginning to end. Number 10, Pat Conroy. Reading Conroy's prose is like watching Little run, and knowing in both that God takes great pleasure. Number 11, Doug Wilson. Here I name the one who shall not be named. I'm no fan of the serrated edge, but his butter knife is as smooth as butter. We'll stop there for now and come back to part 2 another day. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.